is driving with his son. He approaches a winery and sees lifeless bodies all around. He parks up his car and sees one of his men outside, clearly in distress. He cocks a pistol and tells his son to stay in the car. His man cannot speak and is at a loss for words. Lorenzo then walks inside, only to see his men butchered and battered all over the place. The hallways are full of blood and glass, and even a crime lord such as Lorenzo is shaken by the scene. He finally reaches his basement to discover more corpses, and finally the man of the hour being held at gunpoint by his men. Robert tells him that his men didn't open the door for him, and he wasn't too happy about it. Lorenzo doesn't believe McCall done this on his own, but Robert simply says you shouldn't have taken something that wasn't yours. Robert gives Lorenzo 9 seconds to decide his fate, but his lack of a reply leads McCall to use the enemy's gun to kill 2 of his men, and use the third one as a human shield while he lets off a shot at Lorenzo. As the crime boss crawls for safety, Robert makes sure he cries as he does so. He leans against a wall, and McCall ends the man's life. He takes a key from him and makes his way outside and tells the kid to stay seated until someone arrives. As he turns around, he hears a shot, and he scares the kid off. He takes a seat on the ground and seems to be injured as the scene switches to a police car, finding Robert passed out in his car on the roadside. Robert is not well at all, and the local officer takes Robert to the town's doctor named Enzo. He does this so the hospital won't report the bullet wound and asks questions. Once the operation is complete, Enzo asks Robert if he saved a good man or a bad man, and Robert barely says he doesn't know. Enzo puts Robert in his own bed, and over the course of the next couple of days he takes care of him. Robert finally musters the strength to go for a walk with the help of a cane. Enzo tells him he's been out of it for 3 days and directs him to go for a walk if he wants. That's exactly what Robert does, and he makes his way to the street and walks past multiple shops. He stops at a cafe and places tissues perfectly in front of him. A woman named Amina comes out shortly and places coffee on the tissues. The officer that saved his life then appears with his daughter and introduces himself as Gio Benucci and his daughter as Gabriella. She walks off and Gio tells Robert that he had a nasty fall, and Robert gets the idea. The officer gives McCall his car keys and says he didn't look at the bags inside the car either. He bids him farewell and takes off. The scene shifts to a CIA base of operations where a woman by the name of Collins picks up a phone. On the other end, Robert begins giving the coordinates to the winery he was just at. She asks who he is, and when he says concerned citizen, she ends the call. No one is supposed to know that this is a CIA location. Robert calls once again. This time he tells Collins the location and that she might want to send a squad up to check out exactly what's on site. She goes to write down the coordinates, and he informs her that their conversation is already recorded and ends the call. Collins pulls up a satellite feed of the location and calls in some ops to check it out. Robert takes it upon himself to get friendly with some locals, and as he is still unwell, takes a seat on some stairs. That night, he remembers exactly what happened in the winery. It is shown to us exactly how he took out men one by one with little to no effort, but he doesn't even recognize himself at this point. The following day, he finds himself having some lunch at the cafe when a man walks into the shop and takes an envelope from the owner. McCall watches him hand it to some bikers, and Amina comes over with some coffee and introduces herself to him. Over the next few days, he seems to be getting quite friendly with the locals. But yet again, he sees the bikers collecting more protection money from shops. One shop owner by the name of Angelo is speaking to Marco Quaranta, the brother of the leader of the mafia. It seems he doesn't have the funds to pay the mafia, as business was quite slow that week. This results in him getting a mad belting as Robert stands outside and listens to this take place. Marco expects double next week, and outside he is met with the scariest stare in history. Once Robert gives that look, you know you messed up. In Naples, we see the bikers travel from street to street until they finally reach some apartments. Marco's brother Vincent seems to be having a meeting with the owners of the place and wishes to purchase the property. They tell him no, and he simply walks out and greets his brother outside. Behind him, a man crashes through a window, hinting that you can't say no to Vincent. He tells his brother to up the ante and get more money from the townspeople, as he has some big plans prepared. The following day, Robert goes down to Angelo's shop to grab some fish for Enzo. Business seems as per usual, and they laugh at his new hat. Angelo refuses to take money off Robert and tells him it's on the house. Now it gets serious. Robert's call to the CIA has allowed their teams to gain access to the winery. They find pills which are synthetic amphetamine. We are then shown the piles of cash and drugs, over $11 million worth of cash and a lot more worth of weapons and drugs. Frank, Collins' supervisor, says this is a very high-level bust, and it was not even on their radar. Frank tells Collins to find out who made that call. Later on, Enzo checks Robert's wound and says he's almost back to normal. Robert then asks Enzo why he took care of him and didn't call the police. Enzo says because when he asked him the question if he's a good or bad man, Robert said he doesn't know, and only a good man would have said that. Elsewhere, Vincent tells his brother that he will have more work to do, but he reveals his plans to commercialize the town Altamont with state-of-the-art casinos and resorts. Back at Enzo's house, Robert packs his bags and is ready to go back to the States. On his way out, he hears screaming and everyone running towards Angelo's shop. It's on fire and Angelo screams as his livelihood is burning down before his eyes. Enzo settles him and his wife down, and Robert sees this happening and turns around to find Marco and his crew watching from afar. The next day, Robert and the townspeople band together and help Angelo get his shop up and running. In the meantime, Gio is at the station and finds the vehicle responsible for the fire and calls in an investigation unit. That night, Robert grabs a coffee and Amina tells him let's get some food. They go for a walk and grab one juicy kebab together. As time passes in the town, Robert seems to have a soft spot for it and its people. He enjoys their theater and especially their coffee. Collins tries to take a hidden picture and he says to take a better photo. She approaches him and he says you're welcome for the tip. She's a bit snarky and he becomes rhetorical with her. She says she could take him in, but he laughs as she has no jurisdiction. She elaborates about the dead bodies and questions if it was him. He laughs and says he was just a bystander and is too old to kill. His charisma seems to have made her giggle, and with that she tells him to stick around and walks off. Elsewhere, Gio is picking his daughter up from school when he receives a call. They tell him they have his daughter and stop messing about in their business. He can't seem to find her and goes sprinting towards his house. Inside, he finds men kicking back in his house as if it's theirs. His family is being held up and they tell Gio to drop the investigation or else his daughter will be eating lead for dinner. He takes a trip to Enzo and Robert sees his black eye and asks Enzo what happened. McCall then begins training and during this he finds Collins awaiting his arrival. She tells him that he's a ghost and is no longer a person of interest, just an interesting person. She also tells him about Vincent and his mafia, and wants to know why he chose to call her of all people. He replies by saying, why Italy? It has one of the most secure ports in the world. It's clearly not the ideal place to launch such an operation. Later that night, Officer Gio is eating dinner with his family. Unexpectedly, they get some uninvited guests which joins their table. Marco starts asking Gio for favors and tells him he is going to work for him now. Marco sees Robert eyeing him out and walks towards his table. He tells him stop messing himself in other people's business. Robert then replies by telling Marco that it is pure coincidence he is still in Sicily, and that Marco messed up. He and his men find it amusing that an old man is challenging them. But Robert isn't playing, and distracts Marco long enough to grab his arm. Before breaking his wrist, he forces Marco's men to stay put, and literally makes Marco a humiliated joke in front of everyone at the restaurant. He forces the other assailants to leave the diner, and then places Marco's gun on the table and makes him walk away like a little puppy. But the humiliated man isn't too happy, and tells his men to get the van ready for another fire. He begins fuming and tells his man named the Viking that he's going to kill everyone in that shop starting with Robert. Out of nowhere, their van crashes into one of his men and connects him to a wall. Everyone inside the van is dead, and Robert whacks the Viking to sleep. Marco pulls a knife on him, but within a few seconds he is butchered and killed by a pissed-off McCall. He walks away as if nothing ever happened. The next day, police swarm the crime scene, and guess who's quite happy to see Macro dead? But it turns out that the same pills in the winery made their way into Marco's van. Meanwhile, a phone call jolts Collins awake. It's Frank, informing her of a major terrorist attack in Rome. The drugs appear to have financed this attack. Confused, Collins questions the logic. Why bring the drugs through Italy's most secure port? She suggests to Frank that Naples, being a more vulnerable entry point, might be their lead. She promises to gather information to track down the drug wholesalers. Collins promptly approaches the chief of police, demanding to question anyone linked to the Camorra or Italian mafia. She presents him with a file, and after reviewing it, he grants her access to interview all but one person. Ironically, that's the first person she decides to converse with. The man asks her what she's offering. Collins replies, no deals, just an opportunity. Persuaded, he divulges details about the location of the wholesale supplier. Armed with this information, the police storm the premises, and in the ensuing chaos, several individuals are fatally shot. Elsewhere, at Vincent's residence, a somber gathering commemorates his younger brother's life. Amidst the mourners, the chief of police arrives, extending his sympathies to Vincent. In a hushed tone, he informs Vincent of the CIA's presence in the city, inquiring about mafia ties within the government. He advises Vincent to halt all illicit activities, hinting that Collins is close to uncovering the Camorra's strategy of trading with rivals to boost their own enterprise. He wishes to go back to being a proper chief of police and refuses to work for Vincent any longer. Enraged by the audacity, Vincent retaliates by severing the chief's hand. fiercely warning him to concentrate on avenging Marco's death instead. Elsewhere in the city, Colin's phone rings. It's Robert. His voice is urgent as he reveals the Camorra is orchestrating all of this, from the bombings to the drug operations. Then boom. A bomb that was meant for her didn't finish the job as she was just outside its lethal radius. Severely injured but alive, she's swiftly transported to a nearby hospital. Admitted into intensive care, a resolute Frank stands by her side, vowing to get down to the bottom of this mess. The scene cuts to an entourage transporting Vincent through Sicily as he finally arrives at the town where Robert is located. With Gio as a hostage, he yells at the top of his lungs for everyone to come out. As they do so, he tells them to bring his brother's killer before them or he'll start shooting people at will. Robert's voice is then heard from a distance, and he is told to reveal himself. He tells Vincent that he killed his brother, but it was his fault for not listening. He reveals himself from the shadows with dual-wield guns that are not loaded. Vincent says he can take as he pleases from these people, but Robert instead tells him to take him as a prisoner, but just don't kill him in front of the good people. Vincent says this is the best place as they will all learn a lesson not to interfere with him ever again. Robert surrenders and raises his hands as Vincent cocks his gun and bang. Turns out it was Enzo firing, and the rest of the villagers see Robert as their own and begin filming Vincent with all their cameras. As it would cause too much heat for Vincent to kill Robert in front of so many phones, he tells him that he'll be back, and Robert says he'll be waiting. The Mafia then jump in their cars and take off. Later that evening, Vincent tells his crew to get ready for the next day. He's planning to make the town a war scene after he's done with it. As time passes, and a thunderstorm brews, Vincent sleeps in his bed while his men are outside guarding the house. One of Vincent's supercars begins beeping and the guard at the gate goes to have a look. Everything seems to be ordinary, and he drops his gun and begins walking off. Robert grabs the man from behind and kills him. With the gate open, he makes his way inside the property and kills another guard with a silencer. Another 3 men are playing cards, and the lights cut out. Robert, with 3 bullets, takes out all 3 guards. He then grabs a metal rod and takes out the man watching the cameras. As Vincent sleeps, he feels some water on his head. He turns around to find out it's blood. His ceiling then caves in on him and his man falls through it. Vincent then grabs a gun and walks through the glass barefoot. He screams for his men's support, but there is no one that can help him anymore. He begins spraying his automatic all around and proceeds to walk into the next room and is smacked out by Robert. He wakes up tied with a metal rope. He begins frothing and Robert tells him he's got 6 minutes until he dies from the pills he gave him while he was knocked out. Vincent is then released and begins trying to make his escape. He falls and vomits continuously as Robert just stands behind him and tells him this is what you deserve. For all the innocents he killed, he will suffer the same fate. He even gets whacked by a car. He continues crawling on the ground and Robert walks over him like he's a puppy. Humiliated and disgraced, he comes to a stop and breathes his last breath. And once again, Robert walks away as if nothing ever happened. The city is abuzz as members of the Camorra are apprehended in a series of coordinated raids. At the hospital, Robert visits Collins, who thanks him for saving her life. As he places bags of cash on her bedside table, he mentions Marco, a man who lost his pension in a cyber attack. Collins pieces together the puzzle. Robert had traced the cyber attack to a winery in Sicily, dealt with all of Lorenzo's henchmen, including Lorenzo himself, secured the vault keys, and then took the exact amount owed to Marco. When she inquires about Marco's relationship to Robert, he reveals they'd met only once. Upon her departure from Italy, Collins travels to Boston to deliver the money to Marco and his wife. Overwhelmed with gratitude and on the verge of losing their home, the couple is puzzled by Collins' generosity. As she departs, Collins admits she too is curious about the depth of the connection.